Spanish dictator Franco was furious. For decades, Americans had been using Spain as a base for aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. Franco had allowed it. He wanted to get closer to NATO. He needed American support. Now one of those aircraft had dropped 4 nuclear bombs on Spanish soil. A village had been exposed to radioactive contamination. And instead of apologizing, the Americans were trying to cover everything up. Franco faced a choice. He could expel the Americans. He could announce the accident to the world. He could demand compensation. Or he could stay silent. He stayed silent. In return, America promised Spain millions of dollars in aid. They covered the cleanup costs, and Franco pretended nothing had happened. The people of Palomares were left on their own. Their dictator had sold them out, and it would take decades for them to learn the truth. This is the story of the Palomares nuclear disaster, how 4 hydrogen bombs fell on Spain, how a village was contaminated, and how 2 governments conspired to bury the truth. To understand what happened at Palomares, you must first understand Operation Chrome Dome. It was the height of the Cold War. The United States lived in constant fear of Soviet nuclear attack. The Strategic Air Command kept bombers in the air around the clock, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. This was called airborne alert. B-52 Stratofortress bombers flew continuous loops over the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack, these bombers would already be airborne and could retaliate immediately. Each B-52 carried 4 thermonuclear bombs. B-28 hydrogen bombs, each with a yield of approximately 1.4 megatons, 70 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The bombers flew 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They refueled in mid-air from KC-135 tanker aircraft. The operation had been running since 1950-60, with dozens of bombers constantly circling the globe. It was an impressive demonstration of American power. It was also incredibly dangerous. Flying nuclear weapons around the clock meant that eventually something would go wrong. The laws of probability guaranteed it. And on January 17, 1966, something went very wrong indeed. The B-52G bomber with the call sign T-16 was on a routine Chrome Dome mission. It had departed from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. Its route took it across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, where it would orbit before returning home. Over the coast of Spain, T-16 had a scheduled rendezvous with a KC-135 tanker for mid-air refueling. The operation had been performed thousands of times before. It was routine. The 2 aircraft made contact at 30,000 feet, approximately 9 kilometers above the fishing village of Palomares. The tanker's refueling boom connected with the bomber's receptacle. Jet fuel began flowing. Then, something went catastrophically wrong. The exact cause has never been definitively established. Some investigators believe the bomber approached too fast. Others suggest turbulence disrupted the connection. The official report blamed pilot error on the bomber. Whatever the cause, the 2 aircraft collided. The tanker's fuselage ripped into the bomber's wing. Both aircraft were immediately engulfed in flames. The KC-135 exploded instantly. All 4 crew members were killed. 40,000 kilograms of jet fuel ignited in a massive fireball visible for miles. The B-52 broke apart in the sky. Of its 7 crew members, 4 managed to eject and parachute to safety. 3 died in the disintegrating aircraft. And the 4 hydrogen bombs began falling toward Spain. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. 4 thermonuclear weapons fell from the burning aircraft. The bombs were equipped with parachutes designed to slow their descent if released intentionally. But this was not an intentional release. The aircraft had been torn apart. Some parachutes deployed properly, others did not. The first bomb landed in a dry riverbed on the outskirts of Palomares. Its parachute had deployed, and it descended gently. The weapon was recovered intact, with no release of radioactive material. The second bomb landed on a hillside east of the village. It too was recovered relatively intact. Minor conventional explosive detonation occurred, but the nuclear core remained secure. The third bomb was different. It landed in a tomato field at the edge of the village. Upon impact, its conventional explosives detonated. This did not trigger a nuclear explosion. The weapon's safety mechanisms prevented that, but it did scatter plutonium across the landscape. The fourth bomb was worse. It also suffered conventional explosive detonation upon impact. More plutonium was released. Combined with the third bomb, approximately 3 kilograms of plutonium-239 was spread across nearly 2 square kilometers of Spanish farmland. Plutonium-239 is one of the most toxic substances known to humans. It remains dangerous for 24,000 years. Microscopic particles inhaled or ingested can cause cancer, and now it was contaminating a Spanish village. The first bomb had been found within hours. The second bomb was located that evening. The contamination from bombs 3 and 4 was immediately apparent to the arriving American military teams. But the fourth bomb's core had not been found. It was somewhere else entirely. It was in the Mediterranean Sea, and no one knew exactly where. Spanish dictator Franco received the news within hours of the accident. His initial reaction was fury. American bombers had been flying over Spain for years as part of a secret agreement. Franco had permitted this because he wanted American support against domestic and international enemies. He needed the alliance. But the Americans had promised that their nuclear operations were safe. They had assured Franco that nothing could go wrong. Now 4 nuclear bombs had fallen on Spanish soil, 2 had spread radioactive contamination, and the world was about to find out. Franco summoned the American ambassador. He demanded an explanation. He demanded a plan. The Americans were apologetic but firm. They needed Spanish cooperation to contain the situation. If the accident became an international scandal, it would damage both countries. The Soviet Union would exploit the propaganda opportunity. NATO would be embarrassed. Spain's reputation as a reliable American ally would suffer. Franco understood the calculation. He could make this difficult for the Americans, or he could be a team player and reap the rewards later. He chose to cooperate. Spanish authorities were ordered to assist the American cleanup operation. Spanish media were discouraged from covering the story aggressively. Local officials were told to keep the population calm. In exchange, the Americans would pay for everything. Cleanup costs, compensation to affected farmers, economic aid to the region, and they would owe Franco a favor in the future. The dictator had made his choice. The people of Palomares had not been consulted. American nuclear emergency teams arrived in Palomares within days. What they found was alarming. Radiation readings across a wide area exceeded safe limits. The plutonium from the 2 ruptured bombs had been scattered by wind and had contaminated soil, crops, and buildings. The most heavily affected area was approximately 260 hectares of farmland. Tomato fields that had been ready for harvest were now radioactive. The soil itself was contaminated to varying depths. The Americans faced a dilemma. A proper cleanup would require removing enormous amounts of contaminated soil and vegetation. This would be expensive, logistically difficult, and would draw attention to the severity of the accident. They chose a partial solution. The most heavily contaminated soil was removed. Over 1,500 tons of radioactive earth was dug up, placed in steel drums, and shipped to the Savannah River site in South Carolina for disposal. Contaminated crops were destroyed. Buildings were washed down. But the cleanup was not complete. Large areas of lower-level contamination were simply plowed under. The plutonium was buried rather than removed. Officials calculated that this level of contamination posed acceptable risk. Acceptable to whom? Not to the residents of Palomares, who were never fully informed of what had happened. They were told there had been an accident. They were told the Americans were fixing it. They were not told that their village would remain contaminated for thousands of years. The American and Spanish governments conducted medical monitoring of the local population, but the results were not shared with the people being monitored. For decades, residents of Palomares would wonder whether the cancer rates in their village were normal, whether their children's health problems were connected to the accident. They were left in the dark by their own government and by the Americans who had caused the disaster. While the land cleanup proceeded, a massive search was underway offshore. The fourth bomb had fallen into the Mediterranean Sea. American military commanders knew approximately where it had landed, based on the aircraft's trajectory and eyewitness accounts. But the sea in that area was deep, the currents were strong, and the weapon could have drifted as it sank. The U.S. Navy assembled the largest underwater search operation in history. More than 30 ships converged on the waters off Palomares. Submarines, minesweepers, oceanographic research vessels, and support ships created a floating city dedicated to finding a single object on the seafloor. The search faced enormous challenges. The water depth ranged from 100 to over 1,000 meters. Visibility on the bottom was limited. The seafloor terrain was rugged, with underwater canyons and rocky outcroppings where a bomb could be hidden. Deep-sea submersibles were deployed. The Alvin, operated by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, was among them. Divers worked at extreme depths. Sonar scanned the bottom. Underwater cameras photographed mile after mile of seafloor. Weeks passed. The bomb remained missing. The international media began asking questions. How long would the search continue? How dangerous was a lost hydrogen bomb? What would happen if it was never found? The American government deflected these questions. The search was proceeding well, they said. The bomb posed no danger, they claimed. They were confident it would be recovered. Privately, Pentagon officials were increasingly worried. Every day the bomb remained missing was another day it could be discovered by Soviet agents, or could leak radioactive material, or could become a permanent embarrassment. Then a Spanish fisherman changed everything. Francisco Simón Orts was a local fisherman who had been at sea on the morning of the accident. He had witnessed the collision. He had seen the fireballs, the falling debris, the parachutes. And he had seen something else, a large object, descending by parachute, entering the water at a specific location. Simón knew these waters intimately. He had fished them his entire life. He knew the currents, the depths, the underwater terrain, and he knew exactly where that object had landed. When the Americans arrived, Simón tried to tell them what he had seen, but the military commanders were skeptical. They had sophisticated technology, trained experts, naval vessels. Why would they listen to a simple fisherman? For weeks, they ignored him. They searched where their calculations told them to search. They found nothing. Finally, in desperation, they listened to Simón. He took them to the location he had observed. He showed them on their charts exactly where the object had entered the water. The submersible Alvin dove to investigate. At a depth of 870 meters, they found the bomb. It was lying on a steep underwater slope, its parachute tangled around it. The weapon was intact. No radioactive material had leaked. After 80 days of searching, the fourth bomb had been found. Francisco Simón received a reward of about $2,000 under the law of salvage, a modest sum for the man who had solved the Navy's most expensive problem. The bomb was recovered on April 7, 1966, nearly 3 months after the accident. The military breathed a sigh of relief. The immediate crisis was over. But the legacy of Palomares was just beginning. With the bombs recovered, both governments moved to minimize the incident. The American approach was to emphasize the successful recovery while downplaying the contamination. Official statements focused on the happy ending. All weapons had been recovered. No nuclear explosion had occurred. The cleanup was proceeding smoothly. The Spanish government was even more determined to suppress the story. Franco's regime controlled the media. Newspapers were discouraged from investigating. Foreign journalists were watched carefully. The official narrative was that a minor accident had been professionally handled. The most cynical moment came when the American ambassador and Spain's Minister of Tourism went swimming together at a beach near Palomares. Photographers captured the image of the two men splashing happily in the Mediterranean, proving that the water was safe. It was pure propaganda. The beach they chose was not in the contaminated area. The gesture meant nothing scientifically, but it generated positive press coverage and helped both governments move past the story. The residents of Palomares were not consulted about this media operation. They were simply props in a diplomatic performance. Years afterward, Spanish authorities actively discouraged attention to Palomares. The village was not mentioned in tourism materials. Scientific studies of the contamination were not publicized. The people who lived with the plutonium in their soil were expected to stay quiet. Many of them did not even understand what had happened. They knew there had been an accident. They knew Americans had come to clean up. They did not know they were living on land that would remain radioactive for 24,000 years. The effects of Palomares did not end when the cameras left. For decades, residents lived with uncertainty. Some developed cancers. Were they caused by radiation exposure? Impossible to know for certain. Cancer occurs naturally. The numbers in Palomares were not dramatically elevated, but they were not zero either. Medical monitoring continued, conducted jointly by American and Spanish authorities. The results were kept largely confidential. Residents were told they were fine, but they were not given access to their own medical data. They could not get second opinions or conduct independent analyses. Scientific studies gradually revealed the extent of remaining contamination. The cleanup in 1966 had not removed all the plutonium. Significant amounts remained in the soil, particularly in areas that had been plowed under rather than excavated. In 2006, 40 years after the accident, Spain and the United States signed an agreement to conduct a more thorough cleanup. Contaminated areas that had been left in 1966 would finally be addressed. The work began, but proceeded slowly. As of today, the cleanup is still not complete. Areas of Palomares remain contaminated. Restrictions on land use remain in effect. The village carries a stigma that affects property values and economic development. The American government has paid significant compensation over the years, but residents argue it has never been enough. Lawsuits have been filed. Some have been settled. Others continue. The human cost is impossible to calculate. How do you measure decades of uncertainty? How do you compensate for the fear that your children might be affected by something that happened before they were born? Palomares became a symbol of the hidden costs of the nuclear age, not the spectacular destruction of Hiroshima, but the slow, invisible contamination that lingers for generations. The Palomares accident had one significant policy consequence. It raised questions about whether flying nuclear weapons around the clock was worth the risk. If accidents like this could happen, was the airborne alert truly necessary? The debate intensified a year later when another B-52 crashed, this time in Greenland. The 1968 Thule accident scattered nuclear material across the Arctic ice. 4 more hydrogen bombs were lost, though all were eventually recovered. 2 major accidents in 2 years was too many. The political costs of continued accidents outweighed the military benefits of airborne alert. In 1968, the United States ended Operation Chrome Dome. Nuclear-armed bombers no longer flew continuous missions. They remained on ground alert, ready to launch within minutes, but no longer circling overhead with live weapons. The change was quietly implemented. The government did not announce that it was ending the program because of accidents, but the connection was clear to anyone paying attention. Palomares and Thule had demonstrated that flying nuclear weapons was inherently dangerous. Eventually, the luck would run out. Eventually, a bomb would detonate or be lost permanently or contaminate a major city. The decision to end Chrome Dome was sensible. But it came too late for Palomares. Francisco Franco died in 1975, 9 years after Palomares. He never publicly acknowledged the full extent of the disaster. He never apologized to the people whose land had been contaminated. He took American money and American promises, and he sacrificed his own citizens to maintain the alliance. The people of Palomares have never forgotten. To this day, they mark the anniversary of the accident. They demand continued cleanup, continued monitoring, continued recognition of what was done to them. For the United States, Palomares was an embarrassment that officials preferred to forget. The nuclear weapons complex resisted admitting how close they had come to catastrophe. The military minimized the contamination and declared victory when the bombs were recovered. But the truth could not be buried forever. Over decades, documents were declassified, studies were published, and the full story emerged. Palomares became a case study in nuclear accidents, in government cover-ups, in the costs of Cold War confrontation. The village itself remains scarred. The land is still contaminated. The stigma persists. Young people leave for opportunities elsewhere. The population has declined. Yet Palomares also represents resilience. The people who stayed rebuilt their lives. They farmed the land that could be farmed. They fished the waters that had hidden a hydrogen bomb. They survived what their government and the Americans had done to them. The nuclear age produced many disasters. Some were spectacular explosions that killed thousands. Others, like Palomares, were slow-motion tragedies that unfolded over decades. Both types deserve to be remembered. Both remind us that nuclear weapons are not abstract strategic tools, but physical objects that can fall from the sky, contaminate the land, and poison the lives of ordinary people who never asked to be part of the Cold War. 4 bombs fell on Palomares. 2 spread plutonium across Spanish soil. 1 hid in the Mediterranean for 80 days. And a dictator chose silence over justice. That is the legacy of January 17, 1966.